Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Dave back here with you again. For those of you who know me, my channel is about the Zodiac killer. And for those of you who don't, let me just introduce myself. Now, I'm not into murderers or Zodiac or any of that. It's just that at a time in my life about 2 years ago, I realized that I knew the Zodiac killer and that he'd spent a lot of time trying to kill me throughout my life. So I'm telling my story here on YouTube. Now, the Zodiac killer was Frank Lee Morris and the Anglin brothers. He had a little bit of assistance. He also was D.B. Cooper. He told me about all of those great adventures of his in between the murder attempts. Now, one of the things that you don't know that I'm going to tell you today is that I have never seen the Zodiac movie. I was never interested in watching a movie like that. And once I realized that I knew the Zodiac killer, I really didn't want to watch it because I didn't want it to taint my memories that I've been really working hard to bring back about this killer. But I think we're at that point. It's time for me to watch the movie, and I'm going to give you a blow-by-blow description of what I see and try and tell you the parts that I know about what they're showing you based on what Frank Morris told me. And by the way, I want to let you know that both the video and the audio on this Zodiac movie are so horrible that it's very difficult for me to make out what the people are saying in the movie. At the opening of the movie, it's very appropriate that they're playing Easy to Be Hard by Three Dog Night. That song was very popular back then when I was a teenager, and it starts out, "How can people be so cruel?" Very appropriate. And I remember I used to think that a lot when I was in high school, and I'd hear that song, I would think, how can people be so cruel? And I'm doing this little piece, which is going to be a lot of work. It's a 2-hour movie that I have to watch, but I'm going to break it down to you to make it short. But I'm doing it, I don't know why, but next week is Frank Morris's birthday on September the 1st. It'll be his 90th birthday. If he's still alive, well, Frank, you can watch my movie, okay? If you're not still alive, then stay dead, because the world is better off without you. Well, the movie starts out with the shooting of Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mougeot. A couple of things that fit were, number one, they drive up in what looks like a brown Valiant. Now, they were driving a brown Valiant around in Buffalo Estates when I was a kid. They would follow the kids home from the bus stop and watch what they did, and you could see them talking to each other about each kid that was walking in the group. They were looking for people that they could single out for to become their prey. Another thing that's appropriate is that Frank told me that Frank would befriend these people before they would become his victims, and Darlene Ferrin in the car acts like she knew the killer, the person who was coming to attack them, and that was appropriate. And Frank told me, after discussing some of these murders with me, and he didn't say they were murders, he tried to make it look like he got in a fight with somebody or an argument or whatever, but he would always say that he was angry with them about something. And he said the same thing about Arthur Lee Allen and the Lake Berryessa thing, that Art, I think, was angry with the girl, maybe wanted to date her and she wouldn't date him. And that was something that Frank could relate to, because he had that same kind of a problem and hatred for women. The other thing that's appropriate about this part of the movie is that the killer comes to the car and fires a number of shots and then goes back, and then, according to the police reports, he comes back again. Now, this was typical of what Frank and the Anglin brothers would do. Frank would send one of the Anglins to do the first part of the assaults so as to disable the victims, because Frank was too afraid that he might get hurt if he went in first, and then he would come in after and have his fun. And while usually it was John that went in first, and while John was attacking, Frank and Clarence were back in the car having boyfriend-girlfriend fun with each other. The killer makes a phone call to the police department in this part of the movie, and Frank did tell me that he made at least one phone call, if not more, to the police. He made me think that he was calling the police because something terrible had happened and he was trying to report it, but he said some other things that didn't fit and didn't make sense, but I really haven't been able to remember exactly what he told me about those phone calls. About 13 minutes into the movie, they put a Zodiac letter on the desk and they say that the killer gave himself a name. Well, Frank told me that he didn't give himself that name, that name was given to him because he hung around a lounge called the Zodiac Lounge in another part of California. I don't remember where, but he kind of told me in clues and everything that people were coming up missing from the lounge. Police in that area were calling these the Zodiac abductions or Zodiac killings, whatever they were, because of that Zodiac Lounge. So Frank considered that as being the police having given him the name Zodiac. The things that Frank told me about this is, number one, he didn't wear the mask. He said Art wore the mask, Arthur Lee Allen. He was friends with Arthur Lee Allen, and he implicated him in that murder by wearing his shoes and walking around that car up there where he wrote on the door and leaving Art's boot prints on the ground. Now again, he didn't tell me it was a murder. He said that they went up there to get vengeance on this girl because Art liked her and she was messing around with somebody else or something like that, and he threw in his typical, that's the way all women are, and they're all, I mean, you know, he had this thing about women, this really bad hang-up, and that's why he was so brutal to the women, to his female victims. Now, one of the things that I wanted to tell you was something that I kind of pieced together from what he told me, because Frank said that he didn't wear the mask, and he said that he wasn't even there when it happened, that he got there late. Now, from what he told me, because he said he hid behind a bush, and then he said a tree, and then he said a car, like he didn't want me to know which one it was. And I think what happened was he came out of the bushes, the girl saw him, and he went behind a tree where Arthur Lee Allen was already there putting on his uniform, mask and whatever, and Frank told him to go, you know, do your thing. And he goes out there and he makes the girl tie the guy up. Now, if you notice, the guy is talking to the man wearing the mask for quite some time, and the man wearing the mask not really answering. Well, that's not like Frank. That's what makes me think that that was Arthur Lee Allen wearing that mask. He didn't really know what to do. Art wasn't a murderer. He was a psychopath. He was a genius, and he liked to kill little animals, but he never graduated from that to people. And Frank was trying to graduate him. That's what this whole ceremony was about, graduating him and giving him the opportunity to get vengeance on this girl for not dating him or whatever. Now, the next thing that comes to mind here is that the masked man has the girl tie the guy up. And I've told you before in some of my other movies, some of my other videos here on YouTube, that those guys tied me up to a post when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and there was a girl there who I think It was probably Frank's cousin because she looked like him, very much like him. And if we could find her, we would know something. But anyway, she's my age, so she's probably still around. And she untied me, and that's the way I got away. And when they tied me up, they used pre-cut pieces of clothesline. In the stabbing scene at Lake Berryessa in the movie, I can see ample opportunities in there where John, Frank, and Art Allen could have switched up and did their crime the way Frank and the Anglin brothers usually did it, taking Art out of the picture because he didn't stab anybody that day, I don't think. But I know John and Frank would have. Now on the next scene, they go to the murder of the cab driver. Now what Frank told me about that, he told me that he hit the cab driver. He didn't tell me he killed him, but he told me don't ever hit anybody when they're stopped at a stop sign. And I said, why? And he said, because they got their foot on the brake, and when you hit them, they're going to let it off, and the car's going to go everywhere. Well, I've studied some of the police reports that are available, difficult to find, but available on this case, and I found that the car was not stopped at the street corner that they said it was, that it actually rolled another block, and that the killer probably got out and went around and shifted it into neutral or something through the front door after shooting the cab driver. Well, all of that fits with what Frank told me in Mexico City. And they, in the movie, they make it out to look like the two didn't know each other, but I think Frank knew this guy, and I think that they had some dealings together, possibly drugs, maybe Satanism, I don't know what. But Frank would always look for a reason to be angry with someone so that he could kill him. I don't know why he needed a reason. I think he killed a lot of people without a reason, but that's the way it was. And by the way, I want you to know that Frank told me about this hitting the cab driver thing, and he told me that the reason he did it is because he wanted to show them that it wasn't about women, and he really tried to, get that picture across to me, that it wasn't about women. And I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, because, they said I hit a girl up there at the lake and everything else, that she, I don't know how he said it, but that, something about she took more than her boyfriend did or something like that. Made me think it was some kind of a deal where she took more than she was supposed to. But I think what he was trying to say was that he hit that cab driver by himself, or at least use this as an excuse to show the papers that he didn't have a hang-up about women, because he was more brutal to the women in the other murders. And he truly was very brutal to women. I saw these guys stabbing a 16-year-old girl, and they had a boy that they had caught in my neighborhood, and they cut him up and I guess tortured him, drank his blood, but he managed to get away. But the girls, they didn't get away. And there was a reason for that. Another thing that I notice about this Paul Stine murder is that there's a little bit of a question in my mind about whether or not the gun was held in the right hand or the left hand of the killer, because Frank was left-handed, but he was known for being ambidextrous, and he told me that he could write with both hands, and he would do that to fool people when he sent letters to them so that they wouldn't know it was him. So I suppose he could easily have used the gun in his right hand. Another thing is that the two kids that saw the killer described him as being normal. And I've said many times that Frank and the Anglin brothers could stand in a crowd of people right beside of you and you wouldn't notice them. They really fit in well and looked kind of plain. And they knew how to dress to accentuate that. And that's how they were able to move around in Buffalo Estates and King's Forest and never be noticed. They looked much younger than they were. They would take off their shirt and they'd walk around and just look like kids in the neighborhood. Now I'm up to the scene where the blood-stained piece of Paul Stein's shirt shows up, and there's some controversy about that, because Frank told me that somebody tried to frame him and that he didn't tear that piece of cloth off of that shirt. And I don't know if he was telling the truth or not, but one of the things that he brought up was, have you ever tried to tear a perfectly square piece of cloth out of a t-shirt? He said he couldn't figure out how it would be done. You would need a couple of pairs of pliers or something to do it. And he didn't tell me that it was a bloody piece of t-shirt that showed up over there from a dead guy. He just told me that someone tore off a piece of this guy's shirt and sent it to the press. About the motorcycles and the road races, Frank really made fun of the police about that, and it almost brought a smile to his face. It was one of the very few times I ever saw him smile.